When most people picture a pirate, their mind conjures a familiar image: a weathered figure draped in a tricorn hat, brandishing a cutlass and flintlock pistol, sailing beneath the grinning skull of the Jolly Roger as a treasure-laden galleon burns in the distance. Hollywood has done a remarkable job cementing this archetype into popular culture, yet behind every legend lies a messier, more fascinating truth. The real pirates of the Caribbean were not merely swashbuckling adventurers, they were products of geopolitical upheaval, colonial greed, and desperate social circumstances. The story begins with Columbus's voyage in 1492 and the subsequent European colonization of the Americas, dominated overwhelmingly by Spain. Within decades, the Spanish had established a vast imperial network stretching from Mexico to Peru, systematically extracting enormous quantities of gold, silver, tobacco, and sugar and shipping them back across the Atlantic. The scale of this wealth transfer was staggering. By some estimates, Spain imported more silver in a single decade than the rest of Europe had mined in the previous century. This concentration of wealth inevitably bred resentment among Spain's rivals. By the mid-16th century, the political map of Europe was fracturing along both dynastic and religious lines. The Protestant Reformation had driven England and the Netherlands away from Catholic orthodoxy, placing them in ideological opposition to Spain, the self-appointed sword of the Pope. France, though nominally Catholic, was equally envious of Spanish dominance and equally willing to undermine it. Rather than escalate the already costly land wars of Europe, these rival powers identified a cheaper and more rewarding strategy: strike at Spain's weakest points in the New World. Treasure ships making the Atlantic crossing and strategically vital settlements along the Spanish Main, Cartagena, Portobello, Panama City, Havana, and Santo Domingo, became the targets of choice. The earliest and most organized raiders were not freelance criminals, but state-sanctioned privateers, essentially pirates operating under a government contract. Armed with a letter of marque, these mariners were legally authorized to attack and plunder enemy ships and settlements, provided they returned a percentage of the spoils to their sponsoring government. French privateers were the pioneers of this system in the Caribbean. Jean Fleury, François Leclerc, and Jacques de Sorès terrorized Spanish shipping lanes throughout the 1520s to 1560s, capturing treasure convoys and raiding coastal towns with an efficiency that alarmed Madrid. English privateers followed later in the century, once formal war broke out between England and Spain. Sir Francis Drake, known to the Spanish as El Drake, a name spoken with dread, Sir Richard Hawkins, and Sir Walter Raleigh all participated in lucrative raids against Spanish interests. Despite their successes, these early operations had a critical structural weakness. Without a permanent Caribbean base, privateers were forced to sail back to Europe after each raid, limiting their operational range and impact. The Spanish responded by reinforcing their treasure fleets with heavily armed escort warships, making individual attacks increasingly dangerous. The next phase of Caribbean piracy grew organically from the colonial fringes of the Spanish Empire. Around 1625, a scattered community of mostly French settlers had established themselves on the northwestern coast of Hispaniola, living as hunters in the untamed interior. They smoked wild boar and cattle meat over wooden frames using a technique borrowed from indigenous Arawak peoples, a method called boucan. These men became known as Buccaneers, a word that eventually anglicized into Buccaneers. At this stage, they were hunters, not pirates. Spanish colonial governors, unwilling to tolerate any European encroachment on their territory, ordered raids to drive these settlers out. Dispossessed and bitter, the Buccaneers retreated to the nearby island of Tortuga, a rocky, easily defended outcrop just off the Haitian coast, where they regrouped and radicalized. A further influx arrived after 1629, when Spanish forces attacked the joint English-French settlement of St. Kitts and Nevis. Most English settlers returned after the Spanish withdrew, but a significant portion of the displaced French chose instead to join their compatriots on Tortuga. By around 1630, with few resources to sustain themselves and a burning grievance against Spain, the Buccaneers made a collective turn toward maritime raiding. The Spanish launched several attempts to clear Tortuga of its pirate population, occasionally with short-term success. But the Buccaneers always returned, each time in larger numbers, as more dispossessed French, English, and Dutch settlers were drawn to the cause. The decisive moment came in 1640 when a French engineer named Jean Levasseur arrived on the island and oversaw the construction of Fort de Rocher, a formidable stone fortress commanding the harbor with a heavy battery of cannon. For the first time, Caribbean pirates had a fortified home. In exchange for a share of captured loot, Levasseur offered safe anchorage to raiders of any nationality, transforming Tortuga into the Caribbean's first true pirate port. By the mid-17th century, the Buccaneers had coalesced into a loose but surprisingly organized alliance they called the Brethren of the Coast. Before each expedition, they elected a captain, negotiated the division of spoils, and drew up written codes of conduct called articles, detailed legal documents governing everything from shares of plunder to the treatment of wounded crew members. These articles were, by the standards of the era, remarkably progressive. Captains could be voted out by the crew if they proved incompetent or abusive. Compensation was paid for injuries sustained in combat. A lost right hand might earn a fixed sum, a lost eye slightly less. Treasure was distributed according to rank and role, with surgeons and carpenters receiving premium shares given the essential nature of their skills. Punishments for insubordination ranged from docked pay to flogging, while the gravest offenses, desertion or betrayal, carried the sentence of execution or marooning, being abandoned on a deserted island with a pistol, a flask of water, and little else. In 1654, Spain launched a major assault on Tortuga, besieging Fort de Roche for 9 days before forcing the Buccaneers to surrender. The Spanish garrison demolished the fortifications and occupied the island briefly, but within a few years the pirates had returned. By 1660, Tortuga had become predominantly French in character, and a new governor was appointed in the name of the French crown. A replacement fort, Fort Blondel, rose near the ruins of the old one. Meanwhile, England's seizure of Jamaica in 1655 introduced a new and ultimately more consequential pirate port into the equation, Port Royal. Situated at the tip of a narrow spit of land guarding Kingston Harbor, Port Royal was ideally positioned to control shipping across the Western Caribbean. The English governor wasted no time in inviting the Brethren of the Coast to use it as a base, recognizing that a population of well-armed pirates was a more effective defense against Spanish counterattack than any formal garrison he could afford. Fortifications were built in 1655, and under a succession of governors friendly to privateering, Port Royal grew explosively. The town became the commercial heart of English piracy, a place where captured treasure was fenced, ships were refitted, and fortunes were spent with spectacular recklessness. A contemporary observer noted that pirates were known to spend 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of eight in a single night, to purchase entire casks of wine and place them in the street, demanding all passers-by drink for free, and to pay extravagant sums simply to satisfy their whims. By 1692, Port Royal had a population of roughly 6,500, larger than most English colonial towns in North America, and had earned the epithet, the wickedest city on earth. The most celebrated figure of this buccaneering era was Henry Morgan, a Welshman of remarkable military audacity. His early career was built on successful raids against Spanish shipping, but it was his land operations that made him legendary. Ignoring the specific terms of his letter of marque, he sacked Portobello in 1668, followed by Maracaibo and Gibraltar. His crowning achievement came in 1671 when he led an overland crossing of the Darien jungle and attacked Panama City, then one of the wealthiest cities in the hemisphere, returning to Port Royal with an enormous fortune. Far from being hanged as a pirate, Morgan was eventually knighted by King Charles II and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, a remarkable rehabilitation that speaks to the fluid boundaries between piracy and statecraft in this period. Other notable buccaneers included John Coxon, Bartholomew Sharp, and John Sawkins, whose 1680 Pacific Adventure stands as one of the most ambitious pirate campaigns ever mounted. The expedition sailed to the Gulf of Darien, marched across the isthmus through dense jungle, allied with indigenous tribes to storm a Spanish fort, attacked a Spanish fleet at anchor in Panama's harbor, ransomed the city, and then sailed all the way around Cape Horn and back to the Caribbean, a journey of thousands of miles through some of the world's most dangerous waters. The golden age of buccaneering could not last. Its decline in the final decades of the 17th century was driven by several converging forces. Peace treaties with Spain dried up the supply of letters of marque, eliminating the legal cover under which privateers had operated. Ethnic tensions fractured the previously multinational brethren. English, French, and Dutch pirates increasingly distrusted one another and went their separate ways. The unpredictable economics of piracy drove many to seek steadier livelihoods as plantation farmers or timber workers, and European governments, recognizing the growing importance of orderly maritime trade, particularly the slave trade, began actively recruiting experienced buccaneers into their navies to suppress the very activities they had once sponsored. The catastrophic earthquake of June 7, 1692, delivered the final blow to Port Royal, swallowing the northern half of the city into the sea and killing thousands in minutes. The town was partially rebuilt but never recovered its former prominence. Anti-piracy legislation arrived in tandem with the new mercantile priorities, and Port Royal's gallows, where many former buccaneers ended their days, became a grim symbol of how thoroughly the political winds had shifted. As the buccaneering era faded, a new wave of piracy emerged from an unexpected direction: the wreckage of European colonial neglect. Nassau, in the Bahamas, was a barely functioning English settlement, sparsely populated, poorly defended, and largely ignored by London. Its fortuitous position on the Gulf Stream route made it a natural waypoint for ships traveling between the Caribbean and the American colonies. The pirate Henry Every briefly used Nassau Harbor in 1696 after returning from a spectacularly profitable raid in the Indian Ocean, part of what became known as the Pirate Round, a circuit that took Caribbean pirates around the Cape of Good Hope to prey on the treasure ships of the East India Companies and the wealthy Mughal merchant fleet. Every's visit established Nassau's reputation as a harbor where awkward questions would not be asked. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, thousands of English privateers found themselves suddenly unemployed. With no legitimate commissions available and no welfare system to fall back on, many simply continued doing what they knew: sailing, fighting, and taking, now without even the fig leaf of legal authorization. They flooded into Nassau and established what became known as the Pirate Republic, a self-governing community of several thousand pirates operating under democratically elected leadership and equitably distributed plunder, explicitly modeled on the old Buccaneer Articles. The Republic attracted an extraordinarily diverse population: demobilized sailors from European navies, escaped enslaved people, free black mariners, and former merchant sailors all found in piracy a degree of freedom and material reward unavailable to them in legitimate society. Of the estimated 5,000 pirates active in the Caribbean between 1715 and 1725, approximately 1 in 3 are believed to have been of African heritage, a remarkable statistic that complicates the overwhelmingly white image of piracy promoted by popular culture. From Nassau's Pirate Republic emerged the Flying Gang, a nucleus of the era's most infamous captains: Benjamin Hornigold, Henry Jennings, Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, Stata Bonnet, a wealthy Barbadian landowner who abandoned his plantation and bought a ship on a whim, Sam Bellamy, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and above all, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, whose fearsome reputation was cultivated as deliberately and carefully as any modern personal brand. The pirate captain Bartholomew Roberts, who captured over 400 ships in his career, more than almost any other pirate in history, captured the spirit of the Republic in a famous declaration: "In an honest service there is thin commons, low wages, and hard labor. In this, plenty and satiety, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. A merry life and a short one shall be my motto." By 1717, the disruption to merchant shipping had become intolerable for the British Crown. King George I issued a royal proclamation offering clemency to any pirate who surrendered before a set deadline, the so-called King's Pardon. The uptake was modest, and a revised pardon was issued in 1718. More critically, the Crown appointed Woodes Rogers, himself a former privateer and circumnavigator, as royal governor of the Bahamas with an explicit mandate to break the Pirate Republic. Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor in July 1718 with a naval squadron, effectively blockading the port. Charles Vane refused the pardon and fought his way out under cover of darkness, threatening to return with Blackbeard and retake the island. The remaining pirates accepted the pardon. Rogers then set about rebuilding the colony's fortifications, a task made harder by a local population so unaccustomed to any form of authority that they flatly refused to work. To compensate, Rogers recruited pirate hunters, often pardoned former pirates who knew their targets personally and had financial incentive to bring them in. Benjamin Hornigold, one of the Republic's founders, made this transition and spent his remaining years pursuing his former colleagues. The campaign was brutally effective. Stady Bonnet was captured and hanged in Charleston, South Carolina in 1718. Calico Jack was taken and executed at Port Royal in 1720. Charles Vane, after a remarkable run of escapes, was finally caught and hanged in 1721. Blackbeard chose a different end. He was killed in a close-quarters battle with a naval detachment off the coast of North Carolina in November 1718, reportedly sustaining 5 bullet wounds and around 20 sword cuts before finally going down. Between 1716 and 1726, approximately 500 pirates were executed across the Caribbean and American colonies. Their bodies were often displayed in iron cages, gibbeted on small islands along busy shipping lanes as a warning to others. By the early 1720s, Caribbean piracy had been effectively suppressed. The same socioeconomic pressures that had driven men to piracy in the first place, Desperate poverty, brutal working conditions, lack of social mobility were gradually eased by the expansion of the Royal Navy and the growth of legitimate colonial employment. What survives in popular culture is a distorted echo. The pirate as romantic outlaw, the treasure map, the walking of the plank, for which there is no reliable historical evidence whatsoever. The distinctive R dialect, a 20th century invention largely traced to actor Robert Newton's 1950 portrayal of Long John Silver. The reality was harder, shorter, and considerably less glamorous. Yet there is something genuinely worth preserving in the pirate legacy. Not the violence or the robbery, but the radical social experiment embedded in the articles in the Pirate Republic. The idea that ordinary people, denied dignity and fair compensation by the societies that claimed to govern them, could build something more just among themselves. In an era of monarchy, aristocracy, and slavery, the pirates' insistence on democratic governance, equitable pay, and compensation for injury was quietly extraordinary. That thread, imperfect, contradictory, and soaked in blood, runs through the real history of the Caribbean's most notorious outlaws.